before I give the floor to our keynote, I would like to add three things as a kind of a reaction. So, first of all, about the Association for Teacher Education in Europe, you will hear tomorrow a bit more because our vice president will be here. She will arrive soon, but she couldn't be here for the opening. But she will address a small speech about the association tomorrow. And this is one of the things that you should know, that this is winter conference. Its name is this because we have an annual conference in the association and we have a spring conference in the association, and so this was the third one that is organized by one of the groups of the association, one of the RDCs, Research and Development Communities, and it's called Winter because we had to give another name, and that's the reason. And in the beginning it was organized in February or in the beginning of March. But this year we organize it in spring, yes, but the name is still Winter Conference. So that's the reason. And the second thing is that, as you might know, it's very important for us that this conference has a special characteristic that is of dialogue and conversation. We would like to share experiences, so we structure the whole conference in this way. So you are really encouraged to comment, to question, to take part of this dialogue and conversation during the sessions and after the keynote speeches, addresses. And the third and last thing is that I'm really happy to welcome here Peter McLaren, Professor Peter McLaren. It's a very personal thing for me to say something. I studied a lot from his writings when I was a student, and then after that during my PhD research, and I used a lot of his writings, and I'm really happy to meet him here personally, and it was one of my desire to invite him once to Hungary, because I think he is something to tell even to the Hungarian educational arena and even to all of us educationalists. So thank you, Peter, for coming, and I'm very happy that you are here, and I would like to give you the floor now.
Great. I might use your mic. It seems stronger. Can I do that? Yeah, of course. Okay. Use this. Hello. I thought this mic seems stronger, so I'm going to use this. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. This is my first time in Hungary, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank all the organizers for making my trip possible. It's great. I've been traveling quite a bit, actually, over the last few months. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Delhi, India, giving some talks, and then I think prior to that, I was in, where were we, Angie? Can you remember? In Syracuse. We were in Syracuse, right? We went from California to Syracuse, Syracuse to India, India back to the US, back to LA, LA to Philadelphia, and back, and now Budapest. So you'll have to forgive me if I have a little bit of jet lag. I'll be focusing my comments on the situation in the United States specifically, but I hope that there is relevance here for you in Hungary. Because this is a pivotal moment for humanity, when the meanings, the values, and norms of everyday life are arching towards oblivion, when human beings are being distributed unevenly across the planet as little more than property relations as what we could call surplus populations, when a culture of slave labor is increasingly defining the workaday world of US cities, when capital's structurally instantiated ability to supervise our labor, to control our investments and purchase our labor power has reached new levels of opprobrium. When those who are habitually relegated to subordinate positions within capital's structured hierarchies live in constant fear of joblessness and hunger, and when the masses of humanity are in peril of being crushed by the hobnailed jackboots of the capitalist beast. The winds of critical consciousness, enervated by outrage at the use of lies and deceptions by the capitalist class, a class that gorgonizes the public through a winner-take-all market fundamentalism in corporate-driven media spectacle, are stirring up the toxic debris from our austerity-gripped and our broken humanity. Wearing the nationalist armor of settler colonial societies, capitalism subordinates human beings to things, splitting human beings off from themselves, slicing them into pieces of the American dream with the nonchalant dexterity of the Iron Chef wielding an 8-inch Han bazooka processed knife. Capitalism turns living and breathing bodies into things, insepulchering humanity in a vault of silence, engulfing it in a bright darkness and transforming it into the living dead through the occult process of commodity production. Correlative to a capitalist economy, of course, is an unconscious schema of rational calculation governing a neurotically exuberant pursuit of knowledge which involves a possessive mastery over commodities, a squandering of human nature, abstracting from the wholeness of human beings, and thus turning them into fragments of each other, creating the impersonal, quantifying, and utilitarian rationality and alienated consciousness of Homo economicus. We live at a time of intensified race and class warfare, at least in the US society. The crisis, I would say, is epidemic and readily visible in our schools. Taxpayer bailouts of the financial sector in 2009 have made billionaires of hedge fund managers, but have increased class inequality overall. Currently, we're faced with a gargantuan cuts to school aid and an evisceration of programs designed to serve working class communities, assaults on teachers and teachers' unions, and a push for the privatization of schooling and what we call test-based accountability. Under the rallying cry of accountability through test-based evaluations of teachers, wealthy entrepreneurs and hedge fund speculators who've never attended public schools in their lives or taught in a classroom have partnered with billionaires who inhabit an ideological spectrum from Bill Gates to the Koch brothers in order to advance a corporate reform agenda in our nation's schools. Many of those responsible for the neoliberal economic policies that led to the current recession have anointed themselves as leading educational reformers. I invite you to reflect upon the tragic irony of the current crisis of education that leads Stan Karp to characterize it as follows. If you support testing, if you support charter schools, if you support merit pay, if you support the elimination of tenure and seniority and control of school policy by corporate managers, then you're called in the United States a reformer. But if you support increased school funding for public schools, if you support collective bargaining, and you support the control of school policy by educators, then you're dismissed as a defender of the status quo. largely as a result of huge marketing campaigns in the corporate media. It's the ideological right wing who now claim the mantle of reformer, and progressive teachers and defenders of public schools have been placed on the defensive. Critically minded educators are not so easily fooled. Decades ago, I sounded a little heated alarm that urban education in the United States increasingly was malleable to the intentions of neoliberal capitalism and a jaundiced, corporate-infused perspective. Well, today, in a world where capitalism has monopolized our collective imagination as never before, befouled our bodies through a frenzied pursuit of narcotizing consumption, and turned education itself into a subsector of the economy, such a remark would be read by most critical educators today as a gross understatement. Because today, more than in any other time in human history, the perils of capitalism have been exposed. It's no longer controversial among many of us in the teaching profession to acknowledge that, and this is a quote from Chomsky, governments seek to extend power and domination and to benefit their primary domestic constituencies, in the United States, primarily the corporate sector. While the paradigmatic innovation of critical pedagogy in North America, at least, I'm talking about my native Canada as well as the United States, has been significantly impacted by what has been taking place since capital began responding to the crisis of the 1970s of Fordist Keynesian capitalism, which Bill Robinson has characterized as capital's ferocious quest to break free of nation-state constraints to accumulation and 20th century regulated capital-labor relations based on some, at least a few, reciprocal commitments and rights, a move which, of course, has been seen as a development of what we could call a new transnational model of accumulation, in which transnational fractions of capital have become dominant. New mechanisms of accumulation include a cheapening of labor and the growth of flexible, deregulated, and deunionized labor, where women, of course, always experience super-exploitation in relation to men, the dramatic expansion of capital itself, the creation of a global and regulatory structure to facilitate the emerging global circuits of accumulation, and finally, neoliberal structural adjustment programs which seek to create the conditions for unfettered operations of emerging transnational capital across all borders and, of course, between countries, so that the aggrieved, the oppressed, and the immiserated who have subordinated themselves to existing social systems, practicing a developmental terrorism, are awakening fitfully from their social amnesia and reminding those who choose to delay their hypnopompic state that in standing idle, they risk being suffocated by their own past. The window of opportunity is growing smaller for protecting the world against the ghastly panorama of increasing megadroughts, global warming, ozone depletion, marine and tropical forest habitat destruction, the ongoing and methodological destruction of the biosphere, pandemics, mass extinctions, including the possibility of human extinction, and a possible 1,000-year period of unchecked warming that's been referred to as the Venus effect, where all possibilities for life on Earth will be utterly destroyed. Thus, the clarion call of First Nations people worldwide: idle no more. The destruction of humanity that capitalism prosecutes with such an illustrious savagery is not some ramped up bit of catastrophism, but the foundation of civilization's unfinished obelisk, against which we can only smash our heads in horror and disbelief. The chilling realization that eco-apocalypse is not just some fodder for sci-fi movie fans who revel in dystopian plots, but the future anterior of world history that is upon us. Under the guise of responsible job-producing growth, jobs for the jobless, we have an infestation of eco-fascisms whose distracting sheen belies the horrors lurking underneath the surface. Preoccupied with the beautiful translucent hues of a soap bubble catching the noonday sun as it floats aimlessly down a seaside boardwalk, courtesy of some bulbous-nosed local clown, we fail to notice the fish floating upside down amidst the rank and stink of the nearby ocean sewage. As our biosphere goes, of course, so goes the public sphere, including public schooling, with its mania for high-stakes testing, accountability, total quality management, and blind passion for privatization. That usually begins, of course, with private-public partnerships, effectively dismantling a public education system that took 200 years to build. Inherent in capitalist societies, of course, marked by the kind of perpetual class warfare we see in the United States, is a structural violence of a scale so staggering it can only be conceived. Read my mind. Thank you. Just what I needed. It's just water. Okay. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about, because I'm going to focus on the US, and I want to see if it has applicability here in Hungary. But I want to focus on the notion of violence, which I think, if understood appropriately, can do wonders at helping us rethink our educational system. But Gary Leach has argued convincingly in a recent book that capitalist-induced violence is structural in nature and indeed constitutes genocide. Capitalism constitutes structural genocide. Crises, political, environmental, economic, are now the new normal, the terrible new norm whose fearful symmetry has the world's populations from the expanding planet slums to the gated communities of the super-rich trembling. The call for real change can no longer be put off, especially at this nodal historical juncture when the United States' so-called humanitarian invention in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries has been unveiled as just an analog to previous forms of imperialist plunder. When steps taken to protect the U.S. from terrorism have ushered in a veritable police state, when corporate revenue expands as the job market shrinks, when there's such a callous disregard for human suffering and human life, when the indomitable human spirit gasps for air in an atmosphere of intellectual paralysis, social amnesia, and political quiescence, when the translucent hues of hope seem ever more ethereal, when thinking about the future seems anachronistic, when the concept of utopia has been irretrievably Disneyfied. I should know, I teach at a university that's just adjacent to Disneyland. Every night I can hear the fireworks. I thought it was like, gunfire from gangland shooting from neighboring Santa Ana. But no, it was the fireworks from Disneyland we have to endure every night. When our social roles as citizens have become increasingly corporatized and instrumentalized in a world which hides necessity in the name of consumer desire. When media analyses of military invasions become just another infomercial for the U.S. military-industrial complex with its huge global arms industry. And when teachers and students alike wallow in absurdity, waiting for the junkyard of consumer life to vomit up yet another Panacea for despair. You know, Chris Hedges, I was just reading this morning, one of my favorite journalists is a journalist named Chris Hedges. And I was reading one of his articles this morning at about 4 o'clock because I woke up at 4 with the time difference. So, and he writes, the corporate assault on culture, journalism, education, the arts, and critical thinking has left those who speak this truth marginalized and ignored. Frantic Cassandras who are viewed as slightly unhinged and depressingly apocalyptic. We are consumed by a mania for hope, which our corporate masters lavishly provide, all at the expense of truth. Well, I want to speak more specifically about what's happening in education in the United States. Public education today is in its death throes, but refuses to acknowledge its own demise, and its once proud luminaries fail to see how capitalism is responsible. It took me 20 years at my former UCLA to have the word capitalism even mentioned in the doctoral qualifying examinations. They said, oh, you want to talk about capitalism in poverty and its relationship to urban schooling. That's something for your specialized courses, Peter. That's not something we want to talk about in a generalized, exam. It is not impossible to resuscitate public schooling, but we need to be clear about the issues, and I'm going to talk about the macro issues. Unfortunately and tragically, the terms of the debate over what to do with education's neglected carcass are selectively adduced to remind the public that the most important issues that might raise public education from the dead have to do with narrow reforms that all increase, and this is the choice we're given, educational choice by privatizing education. Consequently, the debate today, which we could describe as death-haunted, has an undertow dragging public education into the sinkhole of financialization and neoliberal capitalism, and an understocked conceptual vocabulary consisting of pithy terms such as free choice, common core, competency-based education, and accountability. Competencies which clearly define what the student will do to demonstrate learning for a workforce-related need are self-paced, but must be rendered measurable. That's what they tell us. The emergence of massive open online courses, which are called MOOCs, M-O-O-C-S, adaptive learning environments, peer-to-peer learning platforms, third-party service providers, and new online learning technology, and increased emphasis on learning outcomes and assessment obscures the question of why we're educating students in the first place. Standardized testing lives in a world where the humanity of students is enslaved to a particular analytic structure, combining instrumental reason, positivism, in a one-dimensional objectivity. Its heteronymous dogma is all about increasing control of our external and internal nature, creating a reified consciousness in which the wounds of our youth are hidden behind the armor of scientificity. Reason has become irrational as the animate is confused with the inanimate, and students are turned into objects where the imprint of unbeing is left upon being. Witness the school massacres at Columbine in Sandy Hook in the United States. Now, during the last 2 weeks, I was reading a column recently by Alan Singer. Over the last 2 weeks, parents, teachers, and school administrators and students have marched at dozens of schools, protesting against the latest round of what we call Common Core aligned high-stakes standardized tests. Teachers and principals who were forced to sign agreements that they would not reveal the specifics from these tests that were created by Pearson Publishing. I think it's pretty big in England, right? Pearson. In the US, they just dropped one of my best books recently, Life in Schools. They had arranged to do edition number 6, and we met with the editor, and I spent a few months sort of crafting what I was going to do for the 6th edition, and we met in the hotel, Mark Twain and Angie and I, in San Francisco. The editor met us there. It was at a conference, and I brought all my notes, and they said, "Peter, there won't be a 6th edition of Life in Schools. We know that's your most popular book, but we're sorry." And I said, "Oh, well, you gave me the impression that we're going to meet about the 6th edition." She said, "Well, yes, I did, but I've been just told to inform you that we've become very corporate, and your work is not easy to read." And I said, "Does it have anything to do with the fact that I criticized your company in my book?" They said, "Oh, no, nothing to do with that." But they said, "But we've dropped the book entirely, so we're not going to publish it." Fortunately, literally 10 minutes later, I bumped into Dean Berkenkamp, an old editor of mine, who I hadn't seen in 15 years. He said, he was calling at me from the crowd, and he said, Peter, I haven't seen you in years and years." I said, "Hi, Dean." He said, "Is there any way I could get the rights to Life in Schools?" That was literally 10 minutes after I was dropped by Pearson. I said, "They're yours, Dean. They're all yours." So I think I found a better house. So Pearson, yes. Teachers and principals who were forced to sign the agreements that they would not reveal specifics from these Pearson-designed tests complained that the questions in these exams did not reflect recent curriculum changes. Pearson, of course, has a $32 million contract with New York State to design these tests. Children in grades 3 to 8 sat between 70 and 180 minutes a day for 3 days taking a state English language arts exam. Singer raised a number of questions for Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, former basketball player, and basically they boil down to statements which I've capsulized as the following. There's no evidence that national Common Core standards, when implemented in schools, will actually improve student learning. 2, there's no evidence that high-stakes assessments accurately measure anything other than test preparation and the socioeconomic status of the students. And 3, there is no evidence that the Common Core standards in the high-stakes assessments improve students' education or better prepare students for colleges and careers or to be active citizens in a democratic society. If we want to help students do well in school, my argument's always been we have to eradicate poverty. Finnish students, of course, are not exposed to high-stakes testing regimes and constant test preparation as they are in the US. They do well possibly because they do not have to take a constant barrage of standardized tests. But it's interesting, there have been studies to suggest that students from more equal countries do better in school. By equal, I mean the gap between the rich and the poor is narrower. Now the United States is one of the most unequal countries in the world. Of course, the poverty rate would be maybe the same in Sweden, but Sweden has social programs that makes up for it and makes it one of the more equal countries in the world. The US has no such thing. Let me tell you a little bit about my adopted homeland. In Los Angeles, where I composed this talk, an estimated 260 men, women, and children experience homelessness in Los Angeles County during some part of the year. On any given night, 82,000 people are homeless. Between 5,000 and 10,000 of them are young people. 1/3 of this population holds a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 25% of the population as a whole. Gun violence is astronomical in the United States, and I'm quoting here from Sean McElwee. The U.S. leads the developed world in firearm-related murders, and the difference isn't just a slight gap, more like a chasm. According to United Nations data, the U.S. has 20 times more murders than the developed world average. Our murder rate also dwarfs many developing nations, like Iraq, which has a murder rate less than half of that in the United States. More than half of the most deadly mass shootings documented in the past 50 years around the world occurred in the United States, and 73% of the killers in the U.S. obtained their weapons legally. Angie and I live in Orange, California. We live in Old Town. We live right beside the Army Navy store. I can go in and buy a machine gun. I can buy a machine gun and have that in my hands within days if I want. Another study finds that the U.S. has one of the highest proportions of suicides committed with a gun. Gun violence varies across the U.S., but some cities like New Orleans and Detroit rival the most violent Latin American countries where gun violence is the highest in the world, and I would mention Caracas. Venezuela, I could talk a little bit about that, maybe in the question and answer period, about my work in, I'd like to, if anyone would like to ask me about it, in Venezuela. Now, I just want a couple more contextual notes about the U.S. A very striking and largely unremarked upon characteristic of the U.S. is that in many U.S. counties, in the deep southern U.S. especially, life expectancy is lower than in Algeria, Nicaragua, or Bangladesh, and that the United States is the only developed country that does not guarantee health care to its citizens. I've got a pretty good, health insurance, but if I got terribly ill, man, I'd have to make it back to my native Canada pretty quickly and get settled there in order to have any kind of decent health care. This remains the case even after Obama's Affordable Care Act. McElwee notes that the United States is unique among developed countries in that tens of thousands of poor Americans die because they lack health insurance, even while we spend more than twice as much of our GDP on health care than the average for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, a collection of rich world countries. The U.S. has a frightening infant mortality rate, as well as the highest teenage pregnancy rate in the developed world, largely because of the politically motivated unavailability of contraception in many areas of the country. And as far as raising children goes, the U.S. is among only 3 nations in the world that does not guarantee paid maternal leave. The other 2 are Papua New Guinea and Swaziland. Poor American mothers must face the choice between raising their children or keeping their jobs. It's a choice they make. McElwee offers the following sweeping condemnation of the U.S. educational system, and I quote it because it just really seems to capture the essence of what's wrong. And I quote McElwee, "The U.S. educational system is plagued with structural racial biases, like the fact that schools are funded at the local rather than the national level. That means that schools attended by poor black people get far less funding than the schools attended by wealthier students. The Department of Education has confirmed that schools with high concentrations of poor students have lower levels of funding. It's no wonder America has one of the highest achievement gaps between high-income and low-income students, as measured by the OECD. Schools today are actually more racially segregated than they were in the 1970s. Our higher education system is unique among developed nations in that it's funded almost entirely privately by debt. That's one reason the U.S. is one of the highest tuition costs of any OECD country. Of course, there's a racial dimension to inequities within the U.S. public school system, especially when examining the statistical facts of gaps between the outcomes of students, disaggregated by race and affluence, and comparing them with the statistical facts of disproportionate numbers of teachers among races. And of course, when you compare these to the realities of the school-to-prison pipeline and the resegregation of schools, we can see a national trend. In the midst of this crisis, the U.S. Department of Education and its spokespersons in the corporate media are diverting us away from the central issues of the crisis of capitalism and the ecological crisis by turning our attention to the failure of public schools. They propose as a solution to smash public schools in the commons by privatizing education. And of course, this is not only symptomatic of the United States, but we're facing the imperatives of the transnational capitalist class, and so the challenge to public education is occurring on a transnational scale. Now, there's some, and I tried to analyze this in the context of the U.S. being founded historically on violence. Right? And I'm proposing a tentative theory here that I've used the work of Ramon Grosfoguel, Enrique Dussel, Anibal Quijano, and other decolonial thinkers to help me think through this. And I'm trying to sort of come up with this notion of the structural unconscious. What is the structural unconscious of the United States? And how is it founded on violence? And what can we do to remediate this? And they're looking at this philosophically. You know, Enrique Dussel is a great philosopher from Mexico. And he's really, in my estimation, rewriting the entire history of philosophy from the perspective of the South. And he's been critiquing what he calls the Eurocentrism of the Eurocentrism of the North. Now, they look at, and this is going to be a very sketchy Reader's Digest kind of analysis, but I wanted to sort of throw it out there. They look at René Descartes, the Cartesian notion of the I think, therefore I am. You know, the ego cogito, I think, therefore I am, right? The ego cogito that underwrites Descartes' concept of modernity replaced the prior Christian-dominant perspective with a secular, godlike, unsituated, and monolithic politics of knowledge attributed mainly to European male thinkers. The presumed separation of mind over body of the ego cogito, they claim, and I'm inclined to agree with them, establishes a knowledge system disassociated from the body's positioning in time and space, and achieves this kind of certitude of knowledge, as if somehow we inhabit this solipsistic universe. This by means of this internal monologue, we tell ourselves, I think, therefore I am. But this I think, therefore I am did not suddenly drop from the sky. It arose out of the historic and epistemic conditions of possibility developed through the ego conquiro. I conquer, therefore I am. And the link between the ego cogito, I think therefore I am, right? And the ego conquero, I conquer therefore I am, is the ego exterminus. I exterminate you, therefore I am. The arrogance of being able to come up with the formulation, I think, therefore I am, which presumes a sort of positional, a kind of apositionality, a secular, godlike concept, can only arise from countries that have conquered the world or conquered other countries. And I'm referring specifically to Las Americas, Latin America. The ego exterminus, which mediates the ego cogito in the ego conquero, can be situated in the 4 genocides, or what we could call epistemicides, epistemological genocide, right, of the 16th century, which were carried out, 1, against Muslims and Jews in the conquest of Al-Andalus in the name of purity of blood, 2, against indigenous peoples, first in the Americas and then in Asia, 3, against African people with the captive trade slave, the Middle Passage, against women who practiced and transmitted Indo-European knowledge in Europe and burned alive and accused as witches. According to Grosfoguel and Dussel, these 4 genocides, as interlinked and as constitutive of the modern colonial world's epistemic structures and Western male epistemic privilege, can help us understand how these genocides are reflected in the founding of the United States, in the founding of the educational system, in particular the massacre of indigenous peoples, the transatlantic slave trade, and the Salem witch trials. My argument would be that this genocidal history has been repressed in the structural unconscious of the nation, and I take the term structural unconscious from Richard Lichtman. Our claim is that the contradiction between the claims of ideology and the actual structure of social power and the need to defend oneself against socially constructed antagonisms is the primary challenge that faces the ego. The function of the structural unconscious is therefore to reconcile reality in ideology at the level of the nation state, and this requires conceptual structures to help citizens adjust to its genocidal history. These structures are provided in the foundations of education through coping strategies, myths of democracy, rugged individualism, and white supremacy that lie at the heart of U.S. capitalist society and the U.S. educational system. And I'm just going to throw that out. Now, what is of most concern in teacher education programs is not the impact that neoliberal capitalism has on the way the United States deals with questions of public and foreign policy, or the implications of this for developing a critical approach to citizenship. What occupies the curricula in teacher education is the question generally of race and gender in sexual identity formations. And while in itself this is an important emphasis, and I would say that because I think 99% of the students who've come to work with me or my colleagues in UCLA over 20 years, and certainly it shows to be the case at Chapman, are interested in issues around identity politics, right? Not unimportant in themselves. I don't want to downplay the importance of this or the history of the civil rights struggle, but I believe it's necessary to see such antagonisms in relationship to both the geopolitics of knowledge and in terms of the ways in which capitalism has reconstituted itself over the years. So that's what I try to do. How is this stress and identity formation? As a Canadian, as a Chicano, right? as an African American, how are these struggles around identity formation, how have they become antiseptically cleaved and separated from questions of class struggle? Which they have in the United States. Class has just been reduced to another ism that seems to be left out of this intersectionality thesis, where I see it as foundational. I see class struggle and the antagonism between labor and capital, right, as foundational in setting the conditions of possibility for many other forms of antagonisms that become racialized, gendered, sexualized. Now, the No Child Left Behind Act is an act that was championed by former President George W. Bush, and it's been followed in spirit by Barack Obama in what he calls his race to the top policy. Now, the race to the top policy enables state and local districts to compete for a $4.53 billion reward package for satisfying certain educational policies that include performance-based standards for teachers, administrators, and students that comply with what is called the Common Core standards for lifting caps on charter schools and for improving low-performing schools in creating huge data systems for evaluating school progress. The Obama administration is attempting a sweeping overhaul of this No Child Left Behind Act in terms of how schools are judged as succeeding or failing, and is extending the deadline for bringing all schools up to federally mandated standards. So, but the race to the top is really a kind of shame and blame approach, where, you know, you go in and evaluate. I can tell you one specific example that the Los Angeles Times, a Los Angeles Times reporter went in to do a kind of performance evaluation, competency-based evaluation of a particular school. And this school actually, I won't get into some of the things that happened at the school, probably wouldn't believe. But nonetheless, the teacher, one of the teachers who was the most popular teacher at this school, was evaluated by this Los Angeles Times reporter as being a failed teacher. And this teacher happened to be the most popular teacher among students and among other teachers, generally ranked as maybe the top teacher in the school. Of course, the Los Angeles Times reporter used these performance-based evaluation standards and ranked him as a failed teacher. I was informed that he didn't return. He lived alone, by the way. He was unmarried. All his energy was working to teach these students in a very rough area in Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles. And when he didn't show up the second day, I said, he's not going to ever show up. Of course, they found him. They found his body at the base of a bridge. It's a kind of shame, and they publish the scores of teachers in local newspapers to shame those. It's a long and difficult process to explain, but I'll attempt to provide a little bit more information. Well, Race to the Top was designed to close the gap between white students and students of color. It's premised on this shame and blame policy that rewards the industrious and humiliates the underachievers throughout the nation's 14,000 school districts. The emphasis on the 98,000 public schools across the country is to measure what they call adequate yearly progress by standardized tests. Currently, States that refuse to comply with using test scores for evaluating teachers will, for instance, not be eligible for funds. So, you know, if you're a school board and school district that needs money, then you pretty much have to jump on board, race to the top, if you're going to get any of these funds, any of these millions and millions of dollars that have been made available. But the No Child Left Behind Act is an egregiously flawed act that doesn't support school improvement. It does just the opposite when you put it in the context of the Bush and Obama administration's storied hostility to public education and their neoliberal ideology of privatization. It uses these standardized tests and reactionary approaches to the notion of assessment and accountability to punish schools that it labels as failures with sanctions that make the situation worse rather than improving it, instead of rewarding schools for their successes. The mandates of the No Child Left Behind call for eliminating the academic achievement gap that exists between different groups of students, which are called at-risk students. But it's woefully unable to fulfill its promises. The teeth of its measures have democracy in a death grip. Now, and of course, I could talk about the bell curve rationality of the tests that cuts off scores irrespective of students' linguistic background, irrespective of the school's class background or national origin, and that sorts students into categories on the basis of varying degrees of intelligence based on single test scores. This does little to motivate students to do anything other than to leave school altogether. And I can go on and we can talk a little bit in the question and answer period about the whole concept of standardized tests, and certainly the high stakes standardized tests. I've got no problems with testing if it teaches you something about how students learn. If tests can help us understand the learning process better, I'm in favor for that. But I'm not in favor of high stakes standardized tests. Tests that a failure could mean or could have devastating effects on the lives and futures of students. Standardized testing can compromise classroom instruction as teachers put aside their regular curricula, including important work such as theme-based projects, to prepare for tests. So what we have in the US is we have teachers that spend the entire year in high school preparing students for the tests so that students are expert. They try, if they do well at taking tests. Like, all the effort is spent on helping students prepare for these high-stakes tests. So there's no room for theme-based projects. There's no room or little room for critical pedagogy. And I want to get to critical pedagogy, of course, in my last moments here. But this is interesting. I want to read you a quotation by Chomsky, because Chomsky's talking about the notion of the United States as a democracy in relation to the school system that's set up to help nurture democracy. And he argues that democracy is not a condition that US elites want to see obtained in the country. Well, that's very obvious, because both parties take polls. Both parties know what, relatively speaking, what the American public wants. And both parties choose to ignore that. Right? The last thing that the Republicans or the Democrats in the United States want is democracy. It's the last thing they want. They perceive democracy as too dangerous to their own fundamental interests, most of those being financial. So the corporate elites and their government handmaidens want to keep the public in a state of terminal confusion. Now, the American Legislative Exchange Council is instituting at this very moment a program to try to overcome what they call the excessive rationality of the public. They think the public is becoming too rational. That's why during elections they go for kind of emotional issues, right? Around gay marriage, right? They go for sort of those, they want to sort of, somebody, Bill Ayers, my friend Bill Ayers, who was part of the Weather Underground in the 1960s, met Obama once. Therefore, Obama consorts with terrorists. So they'll go for these, really powerful emotional issues to try to sort of detract the U.S. public from its attempt to be rational or make rational decisions. Okay, this is a program, Chomsky says, of instruction targeted for K-12, kindergarten to 12th grade in schools. Its publicity says that the idea is to improve critical facilities in students. Hey, I'm all for that. I'm all for improving critical facilities for students. I'd certainly be in favor of that. They call for balanced teaching, and here's what they mean, and I'll quote Chomsky. Balanced teaching means that if a 6th grade class learns something about what's happening to the climate, they have to be presented with material on climate change denial so that they have balanced teaching and can develop their critical faculties. That also means, for instance, that if you talk about evolution in a science class, right? A lot of Americans don't believe in evolution. They believe the Earth was created in 6,000 years, according to Genesis. So that if you talked about evolution, then you're supposed to spend an equal amount of time talking about creationism, and that human beings and dinosaurs coexisted together. That's what they mean by balanced teaching. Maybe, and Chomsky writes, maybe that'll help overcome the failure of massive corporate propaganda campaigns to make the population ignorant and irrational enough to safeguard short-term profit for the rich. It's pointedly the goal, and several states have already accepted it. Well, now, there's two ways, I think, of moving forward in critical pedagogy. Now, my mentor was a Brazilian educator named Paulo Freire. Some of you may know Freire, I hope. Paulo was someone who changed my life, certainly, in many ways. And discovering Freire's work, the work of Henry Giroux, very important thinker. Henry was a mentor of mine early on in my career, and I still consider Henry a mentor. People like Donaldo Macedo and others. Now, critical pedagogy initially involved ways of using the experiences of young people and adults as the basis of the curriculum, as the basis of thematics that would be discussed in classrooms. And that doesn't mean, of course, saying that all experiences are transparent and must be taken at face value. You begin with student experiences, and then you interrogate those experiences, because you only learn from experiences that you learn from. Oftentimes, they'll often be confronted by students who will say, well, that's been your experience, Professor. My experience has been this, very different than yours. Or, that's your opinion. I've got mine. Well, I'm not interested in opinions. I'm more interested in arguments, right? Right? Looking at art, an opinion is fine, but I want to talk about developing arguments. But experiences, critical pedagogy, in my view, is a way of introducing various languages of critique, and as Henry Giroux would say, critique and possibility. So students have a way of interpreting those experiences. So, for instance, some of us, I'll talk about
my own modest contribution, but what I've attempted to do is look at critical theory and the Frankfurt School, for instance, and more recently, the writings of Marx, and use those provide those as a template of sorts, so students then can use some of those key constructs to go back and reflect on their everyday life. Feminist theory, critical disability studies, and more recently, eco-pedagogy. The work of Richard Kahn, a former student of mine, David Grunwald, or David Greenwood as he's now called, Tina Evans, and others are doing incredible work on eco-pedagogy. And of course, using the work of Howard Zinn, the historian Howard Zinn, who wrote a book called The People's History of the United States, so that young people can actually read, right, about the history of the United States from the perspective of indigenous peoples, or from, you know, basically counter-narratives to the official history books that are anointed by the czar of history in California, for instance. And so we try to provide various languages of critique and possibility, languages of hope. So our struggle is both epistemological, right, and also involving, of course, the nitty-gritty work of class struggle. So there's a notion of class struggle, of class solidarity, of struggling for what we call a democratic socialist alternative to capitalism. We don't know what that's going to look like. I'm looking at social movements in Latin America in order to gain some insight about new epistemological frameworks that we can organize our education around, and also new kind of autonomous ways of living and struggling from Latin America. And I'm going to finish I think I got 5 minutes to go. That'll give me about 1 hour. And in the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to summarize what some of those might be. I'm looking at the term buen vivir. Are you familiar with that term, buen vivir? I've came across that term in Peru, and I've been following it up in my work in Latin America. I'm going to read you a couple of definitions by Thomas Fauer, who has examined recent innovative aspects to the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia. And I'm trying to frame critical pedagogy around the concept of buen vivir, which basically means the good life. In Ecuador, the right to a good life becomes the central objective, but it means something much different than the notion of the good life might mean in the United States. A bread and butter concern that cannot be relinquished. One of the subsections of the Constitution deals with the rights to nutrition, rights to health, rights to education, and rights to water. The concept of the good life here is more important than economic, social, and cultural, is more than, but includes economic, social, and cultural rights. It's a basic principle that forms the foundation of a very new developmental model. It requires that individuals, communities, and peoples and nations are in actual possession of their rights and exercise their responsibilities in the context of interculturalism, respect for diversity, and a harmonious coexistence with nature. I'm going to try to use Fauer to distinguish the concept of buen vivir from the Western idea of prosperity that we might use in Estados Unidos in the United States. Buen vivir is not geared towards having more and does not see accumulation and growth as necessary, but rather a state of equilibrium. Its reference to the indigenous worldview is also central. Its starting point is not progress, it's not growth as a linear model of thinking, but the attainment and reproduction of the equilibrium state of what they call sumac causa. Both Bolivia and Ecuador have utilized their constitutions to reestablish their states in a post-colonial context and are committed to the concept of plurinationalism and the preservation of nature. Now, it's important to point out that Buen Bibir is not a return to ancestral, traditional thinking, but it's a type of what they call jixi, or a concept where something can exist and not exist at the same time. In other words, a third state, where modernity is not conceived as homogeneous, but as difference. A biocentric worldview that permits the simultaneous existence of contradictory states without the need for resolution towards a given pole, and that conceives of life as a way that's not informed by the opposition of nature and humans. You can find some of this reflected in a book called The Impossible Community by John Clark, who's offered an array of approaches to take from the perspective of what he calls communitarian anarchism. These, some of you have probably heard, the Gandhian Sarvodaya movement in India, the related movement in Sri Lanka called Sarvodaya Shramadana, the Gandhian approach to self-rule. I noticed the quotation from Gandhi right at the beginning of this conference, and voluntary redistribution of land as collective property to be managed by means of the village assembly. And of course, you might be more familiar, for instance, with the examples of the Zapatistas, the landless peasants movement in Brazil, and of course Clark mentions as well the Adivasi struggles and those by the Dalits fighting the paramilitaries of the transnational mining communities in India. By the way, when I talked earlier about capitalism as genocide, structural genocide, take a look at the 300,000 or more Indian farmers that have committed suicide over the last few years, right? And relate that to what's happening with the agro-business under capitalism today. Well, I'm going to conclude. And then take some questions. The omnicidal regimes of our Anthropocene era have brutalized our planet to the point of bringing ecosystems and the energies of evolution and speciation to the point of devastation, and Homo sapiens to the brink of extinction. In all our efforts at curricula, in all levels of schooling, tertiary, right, primary education, need to be focused on this. These themes have to be taken up because time is running out. They have to be primary in our curricula, in our pedagogy, because on the surface, the pace of the escalation of ecological destruction might appear unhurried, even imperturbed, but let's not fool ourselves. Time is running out quickly. We're being chased by the hounds of both heaven and hell with all deliberate speed, and we're being continually outflanked. The struggle that this situation mandates from all of us will not be easy. It will require all of our energy and strength, as well as our courage, and it will be brutal. My purpose in being here with you, and my purpose in the travels I've taken almost monthly since 1987, has been an attempt to create critical pedagogy as a social movement, as a transnational social movement, as a transnational and transcultural network, right, that can link up and make alliances with other social movements in the larger struggle to save our planet. But the energies of love and solidarity will, I am confident, give us the fortitude necessary to bring about a new world, In critical pedagogy can serve as a lantern, perhaps even a beacon, projected skyward, signaling the beginning of a new history. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Now for the conversations.
Thank you, Peter. And now we are giving the floor to your questions, comments, and please use the microphone because we register everything, and we would like to register your voice, your comments too.
Hello, nice to be here. I'm from Croatia. I'm a PhD student. I'm very interested in disability studies. My PhD theme is based upon Foucault, biopolitics. And I see some similarities when you talk about state regulatory practice towards members of certain society. Can you say something more about that due to education and to teacher education especially? Thank you.
Well, that's interesting. Well, yes, a Foucauldian, right. I'll tell you, that was, I was so intimidated when I took a course with Foucault when I was a graduate student that I refused to enroll officially. So I audited the course because I thought if Foucault ever gave me, a bad grade for my essay, although I doubt if he actually graded them, it would forever, I'd forever lose my confidence. But it was a great class. I'm not a Foucauldian, however. I think one of the problems I have with biopolitics, and although I think it's important, the notion of governmentality and all the Foucauldian work that's going on, very important. It seems to me that, I'm thinking particularly of Hart and Negri, right? That there's and this is a concern I have. There's a concerted attack on the dialectic. There's a concerted, your dialectics is, it's the multitude, right? And there's a sort kind of that Hegelian stuff is old. And the self-organization of the workers, really all we need, and we're at that point already. And so there's contradiction, right? Dialectical contradictions. What I think are the motor force of history have been replaced by antagonism, so that there's a kind of retreat to the plane of immanence as opposed to transcendence. The notion of transcendence is frightening, I think, to some of the folks in biopolitics, because I think they see transcendence as possibly, that road is possibly misused and it'll end up in the gulag, right? So I think that Adorno had that problem too. Which, understandable, right? Understandable. So I'm not, but I have great respect for that work. Critical disability studies is something that I've only recently attempted to engage, partly as a critique that critical disability folks have made, that I haven't addressed critical disability studies in my work. So I've just been writing a little bit most recently on the myth of the normal curve, which is very good work. And I'm happy to say that the new university I've just joined, actually I'll be officially there in August, although I'm there as a fellow right now, has an emphasis on critical disability studies. And so I don't, I can't speak directly to that, but I think it's great work, See how I can answer a question, not answer a question, but appear to answer it? Appear to answer it.
Hi, I would like to ask your opinion on basic income. What is your opinion on basic income as a possible solution for poverty?
Well, yes. You know, the minimum wage is just, you know, the minimum wage is a livable wage, right? I think that's what you're referring to. You know, right? Or income distribution in general. I think, right? Okay, right. Well, they've just raised the minimum wage in the U.S. But I mean, my position is there's a lot of reforms. I mean, Obama has tried to push some, you know, he's managed to get the minimum wage ratcheted up a little bit. But I don't think that's a solution. I think a livable wage is mandatory. We have to fight for a livable wage. We don't have a livable wage in the United States. You know, there are people that are working, families that are working in 2 or 3 jobs, especially new immigrants to the United States. There's a lot of jobs in the service industry that you just can't live on. You know, you have to be living with a partner or somebody where you can share, you know, an apartment, and you can sort of, you can share your income and hopefully survive. But for me, these are reforms that are piecemeal, important. You see, I look, some people think that as a revolutionary socialist, I simply skirt around issues of reform, like livable wage. I fight for that, right? We don't have it in the U.S. I fight for it. You know, a lot of people pose the question, well, Peter, you're just for the revolution. Yes, I don't believe that any solution that we have is sufficient in a world of value production, right? In a world of wage labor, right? And for me, I divide the world very simply into 2. If you're dependent on a wage to survive, you're part of the working class. And if you're not dependent on a wage to survive because you own the means of production, then you're part of the capitalist class. You can be part of the working class and still make a good salary. But as long as we live in a social universe of value production, right, through surplus value, then we're not going to be able to have social justice, economic justice, right, and a democratic school system. Now, I don't believe it's an either-or. I take a dialectical approach. Dialectics is not about juxtaposition. Either reform or revolution. Choose sides. Dialectics is about mediation. Yes, I fight for reforms, right? Of course, I go on picket lines. You know, I got, you know, Dave Hill. I don't know if you know Dave. Dave and I have been on a few where we've been beaten and gassed, but I do that. I'll go on picket lines and I'll struggle for the kind of reforms that are possible within a capitalist society. But I have a larger vision. So it's not either or, it's both and. I work in a system, right? I'm part of the system that I critique. I have my own contradictions in my own life. So I work, I push the reforms as far as they can go, but I have a larger vision of the social totality and the changes that need to be made. And, you know, one needs to seize the opportunities that we can to fight for that new world. And I'm looking at different communities that are attempting to do this. Of course, the Zapatistas are one, for instance, the autonomous communities in Mexico, one example. But their approach is more like, we can't resist capitalism, but what we can do is refuse to reproduce it. I'm trying to look at different alternative ways and means. But all I can say at this particular time, because it's been a failure of the left. I mean, there's no real viable alternative to capitalism. Usually when I talk to folks in the US and I talk to regular folks in cafes, right, on the street, I'm always talking politics, and their position is, we know capitalism is wrong, we know imperialism is wrong, we know that the US is an imperialist country, and we don't care. It's better that we have it than they have it, because if they have it, they're going to, you know, send planes into our buildings. That's the answer they give me. It's interesting, back in the 60s, I used to have to make a big argument that the US was an imperialist terrorist country. Most people will reject the term terrorist. That's the term Chomsky gives the United States. But they will accept the term imperialist now. I don't have to make that argument. It's like, we accept that. But if we didn't have these resources, then someone else would, and they'd be used to destroy us, etc. And their argument is, we know capitalism is flawed, but they think that the crisis of capitalism is somehow the result of greedy bankers or hedge fund slime masters. Or, you know, they think that the problem is, you know, greed and somehow, you know, a cabal of, you know, investors, right, decided to, you know, fix the numbers, etc. And so this led to the housing bubble, and the housing bubble crashing in the United States, etc., etc., etc. My argument is that crises are endemic to capitalism. Right? It's not the result of someone's individual volition. I know a lot of capitalists who are wonderful people, who are good, caring, loving people, but capitalism is a social relation. It's something else. You can have nice capitalists, and you can get rid of the capitalists and still have a social relation of capitalism. Like someone was talking to me about, I'm getting off your topic a little bit, is that okay? Somebody said, hey, I saw a video of you in IMPA, right? Which is one of the factories in Argentina. And they invited me to go in because they said they were creating a school. Have they created the school? For adults, okay. So they invited me to IMPA. It's a factory that was seized back by the workers. There were about 200 factories, right? And the owners of the factories kicked the workers out, and the workers said, we're going to stay. And they're turning a profit, right? Many of them, and they refused to leave. And in the government, it would just not be good policy to move in with the military and kick them out. So they made some kind of alternative arrangements, right? And so they invited me to go in, and they said, well, we want to create a school. We read your work, and Paulo Freire's work, and Henry's work, and so we want, our goal is the whole concept of ownership. That in itself is a problem. Anyway, another, yes?
Hello. I have two questions. I'm very curious, what do you think about nowadays situations of the rights of the child in the context of testing education? And the second question is, does the education, especially in the US, prepare children to live in a democracy? Yes?
Well, yeah.
Thank you.
Let me answer the second part first. I'm very long-winded, as you probably can tell, but I'll try to make, I'll try to sort of complete the loop in my answer. I remember in 1985 coming to the United States, and I was nervous because I couldn't find a job in my native Canada because I'd written a controversial book. It was a best-selling book, and and nobody would hire me in the universities. It was also bad job prospects in those days as well. So Henry Giroux said, come on to the US and work with me, and we'll start a cultural studies center, and we'll talk about critical citizenry will be the focus, right? And I got very excited about that, and I managed to get hired where Henry was hired. Of course, Henry had been fired from Boston University in 1983 by John Silber, the president of BU. He tried to fire Howard Zinn. Henry didn't have tenure, so they got rid of Henry that way. And he got rehired at Miami University in Ohio. So that's where I went, 1985, at the invitation of Henry. And we started a cultural studies center, and we started focusing on the question of democratic citizenry. Now, around 1985, the year I went to the United States from my native Canada, you could notice if you looked at the gross domestic product, if you looked at, at the development of certain countries, you began to realize the corporations were becoming wealthier and stronger than some nation states. Right? And the corporations, of course, have been given the rights of a human being in the U.S. I'm sure you knew that, right? They've actually been given the rights of a human being, corporations, in the United States. But anyway, so the year I arrived, 1985, I was all excited, and Henry was all excited about creating this notion of democratic citizenry. And we were looking at the curriculum. We were looking at the books that were being used for freshmen throughout the United States. And we wanted to put some indigenous scholars like Rigoberta Menchú, who won the Nobel Prize, right, with her book. We wanted to put that on the curriculum. We wanted to bring in critical pedagogy. We wanted to use a cultural studies / Freirean approach to teaching and learning. And we thought that this was going to make a big inroad towards creating a focus of democratic citizenry in the United States. We thought we could be part of that effort. But the notion of critical citizenry in 1985, if you really look at the numbers and you look at the nation states and corporations, you began to realize that the writing was already on the wall. The notion of critical citizenship was just a term. It was consumer citizenship that was being talked about and focused on. The notion of critical citizenship was being replaced by the notion of consumer citizenship, the right to consume. What did George Bush tell the US people after September, right, the 11th, 2001? He said, what you can do as a country is to go out and shop. He told the country to go out and shop, go out and purchase things, consumer items. And that's what's been happening ever since. And I put the date at around 1985. And by then, it was, I mean, let me give you one practical example. I can remember about 1987. I was teaching at Miami of Ohio with Henry, and the professors were very upset with the fact that we had a focus on critical pedagogy, right, and cultural studies as sort of the centerpiece of our teacher education program. And they said, we're going to invite the heads of all the corporations in this area, Procter & Gamble, some of the big corporations that were in and around the university in Cincinnati, right? We're going to invite them in. We're going to spend all our faculty money and have a big lunch for them, a big spread. And we're going to invite them in, and we're going to ask them, what kind of skills and attitudes and values should we be teaching our students? And we're going to build a curriculum around that. So in other words, here were educators with doctorates in education who were former school superintendents, who were former school principals, who supposedly were intellectuals, saying, we're going to take our cues from some CEO of some big mega corporation, and we're going to build our curriculum around what they tell us they need. Well, what did they need? They wanted workers to take fewer washroom breaks. You know, they wanted sort of attitudes of loyalty to the company. They had a vision of what democracy was, which was basically it was what you can consume and how much you can consume, and how fast you can consume. Right? That was their argument. And of course, the professors saw nothing wrong with that. And I just think, as I said earlier, we've lost sight of what education is all about and the purpose of education. I'm not suggesting that we ignore, you know, the labor force and jobs, of course, but the question of critical citizenry is something that's seemed to have been lost. You know, it's interesting. It's more difficult now with young people in the United States because Occupy Wall Street, for instance, I mean, it's interesting now. Before in the U.S., you know, it was, you know, I would talk to young people and they'd kind of understand what capitalism is. Now they can tell you the difference between Keynesian capitalism and finance capitalism. And where everybody has trouble is, well, what is the alternative? I think folks realize that this isn't working, it can't work, and it's going to lead to disaster, not just in the United States, but they realize that in the United States, that their standard of living, right, is dependent upon the overexploitation of our southern neighbors in Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela. But what is difficult, of course, I think, is the language that we're using, right? The language we're using to teach critical pedagogy. I preach a pretty militant, socialist, right, revolutionary socialist vision of how we should change education. That is not acceptable in the United States, as it might be in some Latin American countries, but not all. But not all. I remember I gave a talk very much like this in Colombia when I was invited to speak to a high school outside of Medellin. My Spanish is terrible. I had some help being translated. But I gave a talk about, they said they actually came to a conference I was speaking at. It was an academic conference on Latin American Sociology Association or something. They said, Peter, what are you doing speaking to academics? Come to our high school. We want to hear what you have to say. Can you blow off the conference? I said, yeah, I finished. I said, let's go. So we went to the high school. And they said, Peter, a lot of your work is translated into Spanish, but you know, we don't know what your recent ideas are. So can you tell me your recent ideas about critical pedagogy? You know, we know the stuff about using students' own experiences as the basis, and we know about, so I gave them a talk. And I said, you know, critical pedagogy is about making education relevant to the lives of students in order to make it critical. Education has to be critical in order to be transformative. Can't just be relevant, that's it. You can't just be critical. You have to be transformative. So I was giving my talk, but I was using the language of sort of revolutionary socialism, right? And this look on their face was one of alarm. And I said, what's wrong? They said, Peter, we can't talk like you. I said, what do you mean you can't talk like me? He said, it's too militant. You know? I said, well, give me some concrete explanation here. What do you mean too militant? He said, look at what's going on in the community. What do you mean too militant? They said, Peter, we had a visit in 2004 from the state. They came into our community. And I said, yeah. Well, they came in with a helicopter gunship, tanks, artillery, 3,000 troops. And then when they left, the paramilitary came in. And they put their finger on a computer screen and they showed me a slideshow of students holding up white flags, bodies on the ground. The paramilitary went in, dragged people from their homes, shot them in the forehead on their doorsteps. It was called Operation Orion. And they said, if we talk like you, that's going to happen to us. So I said, well, what kind of critical pedagogy do you practice? And they said, we emphasize healing. We emphasize the affective domain. You know, we heal. We try to heal lives that have been destroyed by the civil war that's still going on in Colombia. And I said, well, so you deal with emotions, you deal with building students' self-image and self-concept and dealing with their own personal histories. And they said, yes. And they tried to explain what they did. And I said, well, how successful has your critical pedagogical approach been? And they said, well, before our approach in critical pedagogy, 99% of our students wanted to go in the military or paramilitary before we implemented this. Now 99% of our students want to go to college. I said, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. So I think, you know, the notion of democracy is a contested term, certainly contested in the US. So what I try to do when I talk about critical pedagogy is I try to, well, let me put it this way. I try to be more sensitive to the contextual specificity of where I am and the groups I'm speaking to. It may, you know, when I went to Chiran in Mexico with the Purepecha, right? They're creating autodefenses. They're creating private community militias because they're tired of the narco traffickers coming in and stealing all their logs and assassinating their people. So there's a militancy to their movement. And critical pedagogy is to help people survive, help communities survive with dignity. So as Freddie said, don't just, you know, transport me to different places around the world. Reinvent me. Reinvent me. So what I try to do is share my experiences and see if they have relevance in other contexts as a beginning way of initiating a dialogue about the importance of democracy, social justice. Now, testing, of course, well, what can I say? You asked about testing. School children in the United States are tested more frequently than any other country in the world. Again, just to repeat myself, there's all kinds of wonderful work done by a guy called Alfie Kohn, who's done Kohn, Alfie Kohn, who's written some marvelous work on testing as a form of social control. He also looks at, you know, testing, generic testing, what does it do? He looks at the politics around testing, but there's an even better book that just came out by a young scholar who's using Basil Bernstein's work, a student of Michael Apple's, a former student of Michael Apple's. His name is Wayne Au, A-U. And it's the best book on the politics of testing and assessment that I've read. But he's looking at Bernstein's work on social control. Is there any other questions? Yes. All right. This is the best part.
Thanks a million, Peter. I really, it was a tour de force of what's happening at the macro level in terms of capitalism. And I was having kind of a heart failure a little bit. I'm from Ireland, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
So
I was in Limerick. I was in Limerick a few years ago.
Okay, so you have a sense of
Yeah.
the place. But I suppose for us today, what's happening in terms of critical pedagogy, Freire's work, because we're a country who's been under austerity, under capitalism, and also regulatory austerity within Europe. I suppose we're experiencing both the totalitarianism almost of economic and cultural capitalism. We've been brought in line. And I've worked as a primary school teacher, I've worked in community groups, and now I work in teacher education. And for me, the question is, from my context, and certainly I'm familiar with Freire's work, and I really like that idea. You can't just take him and move him around. We've got to look at what his work and other critical pedagogy, I suppose people who've been in that movement for years yourself, and you've mentioned Giroux, Aranowitz, really how we can begin to think about within our own context in the West. So that's my context.
Yeah.
In the West, what does this mean under capitalism? And one part of me feels a little bit more hopeful at this end of the evening because I think you're right. The fight will go on. There is no easy answer to this. Right. That we've got to break through. And so the question for me is, what is the role of the university and teacher education in relation to transformation and critical pedagogy, and how we do it within our own context?
That's a great question. You know, it was interesting when I was in Limerick. Was it called the house tax?
Oh yeah,
Property. Yes, we went. Yes, Dave Hill and I were there talking about critical education. We went down and protested against the house tax, and the room was filled with people, I'm 65, but people my age or older, people like in their 80s, right? And they said, we will go to prison before we pay that tax. And Dave likened it to sort of Thatcher's poll tax, you know? I mean, it kind of, but that was amazing. So, you know, we just tried to, that's part of critical pedagogy. Let's go. And so, but I think the role of universities is changing. It's quite sad because I know a lot of my graduates, I've graduated about, I guess, 30 or 40 doctoral students over the last 20 years that have gone on to become professors, some in state colleges, most, though, in top-tier research universities. And the students that I have now, actually, a few of the students in my last couple of years at UCLA still haven't been able to find any kind of decent employment in the university. And I was told by a friend of mine who specializes in universities and the future of universities, told me that it's very likely in the US in the years to come that you'll be a freshly minted PhD. You'll go in and they'll give you an office and they'll give you a little bit of startup money and they'll say, all right, you can use the name of our university, get grants, and you'll be living on soft money. There'll be no tenure. You'll go in on 3-year contracts. That's already happening to a certain extent. I was talking today, right? In some places. That's already happening. But that could very well be the future. I know that, I'm very lucky that I was approached by Chapman University, which is a great university. In the sense that it's attempting, at least the section that I work in, are Freireans. And I'm very happy to be at Chapman. The university is a very interesting place. You walk into Chapman, and it was created the year Lincoln was inaugurated. And you walk in one side of the campus, and there's a statue of Margaret Thatcher. Then there's a statue of Ayn Rand. And then there's a statue of Milton Friedman. And then there's a statue of Ronald Reagan. Then there's a statue of George Shultz. And then in the middle there's a statue of Albert Schweitzer. You walk in the other side of the campus, and it's Madame Curie, a statue of Martin Luther King, a statue of Paulo Freire, and a statue of Benito Juarez, right? The only indigenous, one of the first indigenous president of any Latin American country. Now, of course, we got Evo Morales, right? In Bolivia. So it's an interesting place. But, you know, I'm kind of virtually unhireable. I mean, I was talking to Henry about this a while ago, that we're kind of unhireable now. You know, we've written, you know, I've written and edited 50 books or more and done this and done this and that. That doesn't matter in the university context. The production of intellectual knowledge and critical knowledge isn't as important as if you can write grants. So the young people that are getting jobs in the universities now are grant writers. They're basically professional grant writers. They know how to write grants. They know how to structure the grants. They know how to word it so that they can get money from the Ford Foundation or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And what kind of critical work can be done in universities when they're funding you? Or maybe you'll get funded by the RAND Corporation, which has a big wing of US military. So unless you want to work on some kind of project for the Pentagon, in, you know, if you're in psychology, I don't know, crowd control or something like that, or maybe even waterboarding, you might be out of luck. So I think the role of, I mean, so universities, it's sad. The role of the university is changing. The partnership with corporations is just an intermediary step before privatization. So it's, yeah.
So
I think
I'm
we've run
very
out of time.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Peter.
Hey, thank you. Thank you.